15 bikers cornered an 82-year-old man outside a roadside bar in Fayetteville, North Carolina. They mocked his army cap, shoved him against the wall, and laughed as he struggled to get up. No one inside the bar helped him. But then, their leader ripped the old man's jacket. 5 minutes later, 12 vehicles surrounded the bar. Delta Force operators appeared, armed and angry. The bikers had no idea who they had just messed with. Where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments. If this journey of valor touched you, consider subscribing to Silent Veterans and help us give a voice to more incredible stories of our silent veterans. The Brass Knuckle was the kind of bar where questions weren't asked and trouble was always just one drink away. It sat on the edge of Fayetteville in North Carolina, a squat cinder block building with a gravel parking lot and a flickering neon sign that had been broken for 3 years. The place smelled of stale beer, cigarette smoke, and bad decisions. It was a Thursday evening, the kind of humid southern night where the air hung thick and heavy. The parking lot was dominated by a row of gleaming Harley-Davidsons, their chrome catching the last rays of the setting sun. 15 of them. The Iron Reapers Motorcycle Club had claimed the bar as their territory for the night, and everyone inside knew it. Inside, the jukebox played Old Johnny Cash while the bikers drank, laughed, and made the waitress uncomfortable with their stares. They were a rough crew. Leather vests covered in patches, tattooed arms, and the kind of swagger that came from knowing no one in this part of town would challenge them. Their leader, a man who called himself Viper, was a 6'3" wall of muscle with a completely shaved head that gleamed under the bar lights. His arms were covered in thick, dark tattoos, skulls, flames, and coiled serpents that seemed to move when his muscles flexed. He wore a black leather vest with no sleeves, revealing those massive tattooed arms. The back of the vest bore the Iron Reapers patch, a grinning skull with motorcycle chains wrapped around it. On the front, smaller patches declared his rank within the club, President and Fayetteville chapter. He had no beard, just a clean-shaven jaw that made his scowl even more menacing. He sat at the center table like a king holding court. The door opened, and an old man walked in. He moved slowly, carefully, the way someone does when their body has logged too many miles. He was small, maybe 5'7", with stooped shoulders and hands that trembled slightly as he pushed the door open. He wore faded blue jeans, scuffed work boots, and a military green army jacket that hung loose on his thin frame. The jacket was authentic, not some replica from a surplus store. Across the chest were sewn patches, unit insignias, rank tabs faded by decades of wear, and on the left shoulder, barely visible through the wear, the outline of an eagle and a dagger. On his head sat a black ball cap with gold embroidery and olive green laurel leaves stitching along the brim. The letters spelled out Army in bold block font. He didn't look at anyone. He just made his way to the bar, pulled out a worn leather wallet, and quietly ordered a coffee. Black, one of the bikers, a younger guy with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, noticed him first. He elbowed his buddy and snickered. "Check out Grandpa G.I. Joe over there." The laughter started small, but it spread. Viper turned his head, his eyes narrowing as he studied the old man. He saw an easy target, a relic, someone who didn't belong in their world. "Hey, old-timer," Viper called out, his voice cutting through the bar. "You lost?" "The bingo hall is 3 miles down the road." The old man didn't respond. He just wrapped his weathered hands around the coffee cup and stared straight ahead. His face was lined, carved by time and something else, something the bikers couldn't see. Viper stood up. His boots thudded against the wooden floor as he crossed the room. The other bikers followed, forming a semicircle around the old man at the bar. The bartender, a middle-aged woman named Diane, looked nervous but said nothing. She had learned long ago not to get involved. "I'm talking to you, Pops," Viper said, stepping closer. He tapped the brim of the old man's cap with 2 thick fingers. "What did you do in the army? Drive a supply truck, peel potatoes?" The bikers laughed. The old man's jaw tightened, but he still didn't turn around. "Come on, man. Don't be rude." The guy with the snake tattoo chimed in. "Viper asked you a question. Show some respect." The irony of the statement hung in the air, unnoticed by everyone except the old man. He took a slow sip of his coffee, set the cup down with deliberate care, and finally turned to face them. His eyes were pale blue, the color of winter ice, and they held a depth that made the younger biker take an unconscious step back. "I drove a truck," the old man said, his voice quiet, steady, like gravel rolling under calm water. "Among other things." Viper grinned, sensing weakness. "Among other things, right." He reached out and flicked the cap off the old man's head. It tumbled to the floor, landing in a small puddle of spilled beer. The old man didn't flinch. He just looked down at the cap, then back up at Viper. Still, he said nothing. "What's the matter, old man?" Viper leaned in, his breath hot and reeking of whiskey. "You gonna cry? You gonna tell me about the good old days when men were men?" One of the other bikers, emboldened, stepped forward and grabbed the old man's jacket, yanking it hard. "This thing probably has moths in it. You should donate it to Goodwill, Gramps." The old man's hand moved to the jacket, gently pulling it back into place. His fingers brushed over a worn patch on the shoulder. It was faded, nearly illegible, but if someone looked closely, they could make out the shape of an eagle and a dagger. When his fingertips touched that patch, something happened inside his mind. The bar around him seemed to dissolve. The laughter, the music, the smell of beer, it all faded away like smoke. He was no longer in North Carolina. He was back there. Back in the hell he'd spent 30 years trying to forget. Mogadishu, Somalia, October 1993. This wasn't the present. This was a memory, a flashback to a different time, a different war, when the old man wasn't old at all. The heat was suffocating. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the metallic smell of blood. The streets were a nightmare of rubble, burning vehicles and bodies. Gunfire echoed from every direction, a constant roar that never stopped. A younger version of the old man crouched behind the twisted wreckage of a burned-out car. He was 23 years old then, lean and fast, with a face that hadn't yet been carved by decades of remembering. His hands were steady on his rifle. His breathing was controlled. His eyes, the same pale blue, scanned the shattered buildings ahead. His call sign was Reaper. Through the scope of his rifle, he tracked a hostile moving through a broken window 200 yards away. The wind was chaos. The heat shimmer made the air dance like water, but his breathing slowed. His heartbeat steadied. He squeezed the trigger once. The figure dropped. "Reaper, we need extract now," a voice screamed in his earpiece, frantic and desperate. "The building's coming down. We're taking fire from 3 sides." He didn't run. He stayed. He covered his team as they pulled back, one by one. He made sure every single man made it out alive. Only when the last boot disappeared around the corner did he move, sprinting through the chaos, the world exploding behind him in fire and concrete. That was 30 years ago. That was when he earned the name. That was when he became the man the bikers didn't know they were standing in front of. The old man blinked. The memory released him. He was back in the brass knuckle. The jukebox was still playing. The bikers were still laughing. Viper was still talking, his voice full of arrogance and ignorance. "You know what I think," Viper said, reaching out and grabbing the old man's jacket again. This time, he yanked it hard, and the fabric tore near the shoulder. The patch, the one with the eagle and the dagger, ripped slightly, hanging by a single thread. "I think you're just another fake," Viper sneered. "Probably bought this at a surplus store to get free coffee at Denny's." The old man's eyes, which had been distant, lost in memory, suddenly sharpened. His voice, when it came, was no longer quiet. It was cold. Final. "Take your hand off me." Viper laughed, his grip tightening on the torn fabric. "Or what, old man? You gonna—" He never finished the sentence. Actually, the confrontation had already spilled outside. Viper had grabbed Daniel by the collar of his army jacket and shoved him out the front door into the gravel parking lot. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the rows of gleaming Harley-Davidsons. The other bikers followed, forming a half circle around the old man. Viper's grip was tight on Daniel's jacket, twisting the fabric near the shoulder where the faded eagle and dagger patch was sewn. The late afternoon light caught the patches on Daniel's chest, unit crests, combat badges, all worn and frayed but still there, still telling a story. Some of the bar's other patrons had come outside too, watching from the doorway but too afraid to intervene. Daniel's back was against the wooden siding of the building. His army cap had been knocked off again and lay in the dirt near his feet. Viper leaned in close, his tattooed arms flexing, his voice low and threatening. "You think you're tough, that old man. You think that jacket means something." Daniel's pale blue eyes didn't blink. He didn't struggle. He just stared at Viper with the kind of calm that comes from having faced far worse than this. That's when they heard it. The rumble of engines. Not motorcycles. Vehicles. Big ones. Coming fast. The sound grew louder. It wasn't the throaty roar of Harley engines. It was something deeper, more purposeful. Military diesel engines pushing hard. The first vehicle came into view, a black Chevrolet Suburban with government plates, kicking up a cloud of dust as it skidded into the parking lot. Then another, then a third. Within seconds, 12 vehicles had surrounded the brass knuckle, forming a tactical perimeter that would make any military planner proud. Doors flew open before the vehicles had fully stopped. Men poured out. They weren't police. They weren't military police. They were something else entirely. The first man out was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of build that came from functional strength, not gym vanity. He wore dark tactical pants, a black compression shirt that showed every muscle, and a plate carrier vest even though this wasn't a combat zone. His arms were thick and scarred. His jaw was set like carved granite. Everything about him screamed active duty operator. This wasn't security. This wasn't local police. This was something else entirely. Behind him, more men emerged. Some wore civilian clothes, others wore full tactical gear. All of them moved with the same fluid, deadly precision. They spread out across the parking lot, cutting off every exit, their eyes scanning for threats with the kind of situational awareness that only comes from years of operating in hostile territory. Viper's hand slowly released Daniel's jacket. His swagger evaporated like steam off hot asphalt. The other bikers looked around nervously, suddenly aware that they were surrounded by men who operated on a completely different level. "Who the hell are you?" Viper demanded, but his voice had lost its edge. The first man through, the one who looked like he could break Viper in half without breaking a sweat, ignored him completely. His eyes locked onto Daniel. He walked forward, his boots crunching on the gravel, and when he reached the old man, he did something that made every person in the parking lot hold their breath. He stood at attention and saluted. Sharp, crisp, perfect. "Sir," the man said, his voice respectful, almost reverent. "We got the call. Are you all right?" Daniel looked up at him, and for the first time since entering the bar, a faint trace of something, maybe amusement, maybe relief, crossed his weathered face. "I'm fine, Marcus. Just having coffee." The man called Marcus finally turned his attention to Viper and his crew. His expression went from respectful to glacial in an instant. "Which one of you put hands on him?" No one answered. The bikers, who minutes ago had been kings of this parking lot, now looked like children caught doing something they knew was wrong. Marcus took a step toward Viper. "I asked you a question." "Listen, man," Viper said, trying to sound tough but failing miserably. "We didn't know." "You didn't know what?" Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. "You didn't know that assaulting an 82-year-old man makes you a coward, or you didn't know who he was." Viper's mouth opened and closed like a fish. He had no answer. One of the other operators, a younger man with a scar running down his left cheek, spoke up. His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "That old man you just shoved against a wall. That's Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Cross, retired Delta Force, 3 tours in Somalia, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan." He paused, letting each word land like a hammer. "The man you just disrespected has more confirmed kills than all of you have brain cells combined." The color drained from Viper's face. Marcus continued, his eyes never leaving the biker leader. "In 1993, during the Battle of Mogadishu, when 2 Blackhawks went down and the entire mission turned into a nightmare, he was part of the team that went in to pull our boys out. While politicians were deciding whether to send help, he was already there, in the streets, in the fire, The bartender, Diane, had come outside. She stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide, staring at the old man she'd served coffee to 100 times before. Marcus gestured to the torn patch on Daniel's jacket. "You see that patch? That's not from a surplus store. That's the Combat Applications Group insignia. Delta Force. It's not something you buy. It's something you earn by doing things most people can't even imagine." Another operator stepped forward. He was older than the others, maybe in his 50s, with gray at his temples, and the kind of weathered look that only comes from decades of hard living. Chief Cross trained half the operators currently serving in Delta. He wrote portions of the close quarters combat manual we still use today. Daniel held up a hand. "Now that's enough, gentlemen." "With all due respect, sir," Marcus said, his jaw tight. "It's not nearly enough." He turned back to Viper. "You want to know what really happened in Mogadishu?" When his unit was pinned down, outnumbered 20-1 and with no air support and no reinforcements coming, he held a position for 6 hours. Alone. He gave his team time to evacuate the wounded. Another memory hit Daniel Cross. This one came faster, sharper, like a knife between the ribs. The memory: Mogadishu, Somalia, October 4th, 1993, 04:30 hours. This was another flashback, another piece of the past breaking through into the present. The sun was starting to rise, painting the smoke-filled sky a sick orange color. Daniel was on the 3rd floor of a partially collapsed building. His rifle was hot to the touch. He'd stopped counting shots an hour ago. Below him, in the street, his team was loading the last of the wounded into a commandeered truck. The enemy was closing in from 3 directions. He could hear them shouting, their footsteps on broken glass and rubble. "Reaper, you need to move now." His team leader's voice crackled in his earpiece. "We're leaving in 30 seconds with or without you." Daniel didn't answer. He sighted down his scope and dropped another hostile moving through an alley. Then another. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. But inside, in a place he'd never talk about, he knew he might not make it out. "Reaper, goddammit, move!" He took one last shot, then grabbed his rifle and ran. He didn't run away from the enemy. He ran toward his team, through a gauntlet of gunfire, diving through windows, vaulting over rubble. A round caught his shoulder, spinning him halfway around, but he didn't stop. He made it to the truck. Hands pulled him in. The vehicle lurched forward, rounds sparking off the armored sides. The medic pressed gauze into his shoulder. "You're insane, Cross." Daniel just shook his head, his breath ragged. "Just getting everyone home." Back in the parking lot. Present day. Daniel's hand unconsciously moved to his right shoulder, where an old scar still ached when it rained. The parking lot came back into focus. The operators were still standing around him like a protective wall. The bikers looked like they wanted to melt into the ground. Viper tried one more time to salvage the situation. "Look, we made a mistake. We didn't mean any disrespect. We'll just go." "No," Marcus said flatly. "You'll stay right there." From the road, the sound of more vehicles arriving filled the air. Doors slammed. Boots hit gravel. More men entered the parking lot. 8 and 10, 12 of them. Some wore uniforms. Some wore civilian clothes. All of them had the same look: hard, professional, deadly. A man in his 60s arrived last. He wore a crisp army uniform with the rank of colonel on his shoulders. His hair was steel gray, his back straight as a rifle barrel. He walked directly to Daniel and extended his hand. "Chief," the colonel said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's been too long." Daniel stood slowly, his old joints protesting, and shook the colonel's hand. "Tom, you didn't have to come all the way out here." "Yes, I did," Colonel Tom Hendrix replied. He turned to face the bikers, and his expression turned to stone. "I got a call 15 minutes ago that someone put their hands on the man who saved my life in Mogadishu. The man who carried me 3 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in his own shoulder because I couldn't walk." The colonel's voice rose, filling every corner of the parking lot. This man didn't ask for a medal, didn't ask for recognition. He did his job and then he disappeared. He went back to civilian life, quiet and humble, asking for nothing. He pointed at Viper. "And you had the audacity to put your hands on him." Viper looked like he might throw up. The colonel reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing a tarnished silver medal. Chief Cross refused this 30 years ago. It's the Silver Star, for valor in combat. He told command to give it to someone else, someone who needed it more. He held it up for everyone to see. He spent 3 decades working as a janitor at Fort Bragg, living in a small apartment, asking for nothing, but he's a legend, a ghost. The man they called the Reaper. A hushed murmur went through the crowd. Even some of the bikers recognized that name. It was a story, a myth, something you heard late at night from old soldiers who'd had too much to drink. "It's him," one of the younger bikers whispered. The colonel nodded. "It's him." The silence in the parking lot was suffocating. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and the floodlights from the vehicles cast harsh shadows across the gravel. Every eye was on Daniel Cross. The old man who had walked into a bar asking for nothing more than a cup of coffee was now revealed to be something else entirely. A living legend, a ghost from a war most people had only seen in movies. Viper's hands trembled. His crew, the Iron Reapers, the men who had terrorized this stretch of highway for years, looked small, insignificant. The swagger, the leather, the chrome, it all meant nothing in the presence of real warriors. Colonel Hendrix stepped closer to Viper, the silver star still gleaming in his hand. "Do you know what valor means?" he asked, his voice quiet now, but somehow more terrifying than when he'd been shouting. "It doesn't mean being loud. It doesn't mean intimidating people weaker than you. It means standing in the gap when everyone else runs. It means carrying your brothers out of hell when your own body is broken." Viper couldn't meet his eyes. "This man," the colonel continued, gesturing to Daniel, "spent 6 hours in a kill zone so that 19 other men could go home to their families. He took 7 rounds, 3 in the vest, 2 in his shoulder, 1 grazed his neck, and 1 went through his thigh." He paused, letting the words settle, and when they finally extracted him, the first thing he asked was whether everyone else made it out. One of the bikers, the younger one with the snake tattoo, spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't know, sir. We thought he was, you thought he was nobody." Marcus finished for him, his tone cutting. "That's the problem. You looked at him and saw someone you could push around. Someone who didn't matter." Daniel Cross finally spoke. His voice was still quiet, but now everyone in the parking lot was listening. "That's all right, son," he said, looking at the young biker. "Most people do." He bent down slowly. It took effort, his back protesting, and picked up his army cap from the dirt. He wiped it carefully with his hand, then placed it back on his head. "You want to know the truth?" Daniel said, looking at Viper now. "I don't blame you for not knowing who I am. That was the point. I didn't serve for recognition. I served because someone had to, because there were men counting on me, because the mission mattered more than my name in a history book." He took a step closer to the biker leader. Viper was a big man, but he looked small now, diminished. "But here's what you need to understand," Daniel continued. "Respect isn't something you take. It's something you earn, and you don't earn it by pushing around people you think are weak. You earn it by lifting them up, by standing for something bigger than yourself." Viper's eyes were wet. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Daniel stepped forward and placed his weathered, age-spotted hand on Viper's massive tattooed shoulder, the same shoulder that had shoved him against the wall, the same arm that had twisted his army jacket and tried to humiliate him. The contrast was striking. Daniel's thin, liver-spotted hand resting on Viper's thick, tattooed bicep. An old man and a brute. But in that moment, it was clear who had the real power. "I don't want an apology," Daniel said gently. "I want you to remember this. I want you to remember that every person you meet is carrying something you can't see. Every old man you pass on the street might be a hero. Every quiet woman at the grocery store might have survived something you couldn't imagine. Treat people like they matter. Because they do." The parking lot was so quiet you could hear the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Colonel Hendrix stepped forward and held out the silver star to Daniel once more. "Chief, I know you didn't want this 30 years ago, but it's yours. It always was." Daniel looked at the medal for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "Keep it, Tom. Give it to one of the young operators. Someone still in the fight. He smiled faintly. I got everything I needed. What did you need, sir? Marcus asked. Daniel gestured around the parking lot, at the operators, at the colonel, at the faces of the men who had dropped everything and raced across town the moment they heard he was in trouble. This, knowing that the Brotherhood doesn't end when you take off the uniform, knowing that you boys still have my back, even 30 years later. His voice cracked slightly. That's worth more than any medal. Marcus stepped forward and embraced the old man. One by one, the other operators did the same. Some of them had tears in their eyes. These were men who had jumped out of airplanes, kicked down doors in hostile territory, and faced death without flinching. But this broke them. Colonel Hendrix turned to Diane, the bartender, who had been watching from the doorway with tears streaming down her face. Ma'am, whatever Chief Cross orders in this bar for the rest of his life, it's on the house. And if anyone gives him trouble, you call this number. He handed her a card. Day or night, we'll be here. Diane nodded, clutching the card like it was made of gold. The colonel then turned to Viper and his crew. His expression hardened again. As for you, you have two choices. Choice 1, I press charges. Assault on a veteran, destruction of military property. He pointed at the torn jacket. You'll spend the next few years thinking about your decisions in a federal prison. Viper's face went gray. Choice 2, the colonel continued. You walk out of here and you spend the rest of your lives being better men. You see a veteran, you show respect. You see someone who needs help. You help them. You turn that club of yours into something that actually stands for something. Viper nodded frantically. Yes, sir. We will. I swear. Good. The colonel leaned in close. Because if I ever hear that you or your crew disrespected another veteran, I will come back, and I won't be alone. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. Then get out. The Iron Reapers didn't need to be told twice. They mounted their motorcycles silently, their heads down, their bravado shattered. The sound of their engines starting up and roaring away echoed through the parking lot, fading into the distance. When they were gone, the tension in the parking lot finally broke. A few of the operators laughed, clapping each other on the back. Someone turned on a radio in one of the vehicles. Johnny Cash was playing, the same song that had been on the jukebox inside. Daniel walked back toward the bar. Diane met him at the door with a fresh cup of coffee. On the house, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Forever. Thank you, ma'am, Daniel said with a slight nod. He sat back down at the bar, in the same seat he'd been in before. Colonel Hendrix sat down beside him. You know, Chief, you could have told them who you were at any point. Could have saved yourself the trouble. Daniel took a sip of his coffee and stared out the window at the fading daylight. Maybe. But then they wouldn't have learned anything. They would have just been scared. Fear doesn't teach. It just makes people smaller. Marcus sat down on Daniel's other side. Permission to speak freely, sir? Always, Marcus. You're still one hell of an operator. Daniel chuckled. A dry, warm sound. And I'm an 82-year-old janitor with bad knees and a hearing aid, son. But thank you. No, sir, Marcus said seriously. You're the Reaper, and you always will be. Daniel looked down at his army jacket. The fabric near the shoulder was torn where Viper had grabbed it. The eagle and dagger patch hung by a few threads. He touched it gently, then carefully tucked the loose threads back into place. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect again, but it was still his. Still carried the weight of every mission, every brother lost, every promise kept. Marcus noticed and knelt down beside him. Sir, we can get that repaired. There's a seamstress on base who specializes in... Daniel shook his head. Leave it, son. It's just another scar. I've got plenty of those. 3 weeks later, the Iron Reapers Motorcycle Club held a fundraiser. It wasn't for themselves. It was for the Wounded Warrior Project. They raised $18,000. At the event, Viper stood on a small stage and told the story, his version of it, about the night they met a real hero and learned what respect actually meant. He didn't use Daniel's name. He didn't need to. At Fort Bragg, a new training program was introduced for young soldiers. It was called the Cross Protocol. It taught situational awareness, humility, and the importance of recognizing quiet heroes. Every recruit was told the story of the old man in the bar and the lesson he taught without raising his voice. Daniel Cross continued working as a janitor. He mopped floors, emptied trash cans, and nodded politely to the young soldiers who passed him in the halls. Most of them had no idea who he was, but some did. And those who knew made sure his coffee was always hot, his path was always clear, and his legacy was never forgotten. One afternoon, as Daniel was finishing his shift, a young private approached him nervously. "Excuse me, sir. Are you the Reaper?" Daniel smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "I'm just the janitor, son." The private nodded slowly, understanding. "Yes, sir, but thank you for everything." Daniel watched the young man walk away, and for a moment, he wasn't 82 anymore. He was 23, standing in the smoke and chaos, doing what needed to be done, not for glory, not for medals, for the man next to him.